Okay, well, thank you, Theo, for the kind introduction. Hopefully I can follow that somehow. Also, thank you to the AA for the invitation to give this talk, and also welcome to the audience for coming tonight. It's actually quite great to be here again. I think it's been 13 years since I was in this room the last time. I was here teaching at the AA Summer School program with Katarina Dionysopoulou and Jennifer Bonner. And the final review was in this room. And I also recall a couple of canonical lectures that I tried to go to and attended during the years. There was an event where Peter Eisenman and Rem Koolhaas were literally sitting here and battling about form versus function. And I have to say Rem Koolhaas won that one, hands down. And maybe more interesting was I was trying to come and see Zaha Hadid lecture here. And the building was so packed, it was literally impossible to get inside, and we had to go to one of the overflow rooms upstairs. We started watching the lecture on a screen. And when it was over, we were basically joyfully clapping at the TV, which is kind of awkward, but because it was so full in this house, the entire building felt like it was shaking out of, with energy. So there's obviously a lot of history surrounding the AA and this facility. And as you know, this lecture series is titled New Canonical Histories. And with this talk, I was trying to respond to that topic, which is actually very charged in a way, but I will try to engage with this discourse by sharing some of my projects and design processes, and how we are maybe writing new histories potentially as we speak. So our work, and I say our work because this work is not just credited to myself. There's a lot of employees, collaborators, consultants who we worked with over the years, and obviously without their efforts and contribution, this wouldn't be possible. So that's quite important to mention. So our work is not necessarily architecture with a capital A, maybe as Theo mentioned, but constantly shifting between product design, installation, art, fashion, infrastructure. And as a creative practice, it's very important to me to embrace other disciplines and not just look into our own discipline. And also introduce new technologies, new techniques, and actually, historically speaking, that's when architecture has been most successful, when we actually reached out and brought other technologies into our discipline. If you think about the Renaissance with the perspective, or even like the idea of the elevator coming in, and that's why we can build towers. So that's quite important to sometimes do that. And when I talk to, in conversations to people, and we talk about me being an architect, the question always comes up, oh, you're an architect? Interesting. So do you do commercial or residential projects? Yeah, you heard that question, right? And my answer usually is yes. But what I really want to respond, or what I should respond, is that I'm interested in design as a cultural practice. And I'm trying to achieve this by reappropriating existing paradigms of design typology. For example, can we rethink what a bridge is? Can we rethink what a bench should be? Can we rethink what a playground should look like? And we want to contribute towards a discourse on how we can enhance public domain. I think that's quite an important feature at the moment. And we want to do it by forming new opportunities for physical engagement, so how we occupy space. And we'll try it by doing visual participation, so how do we communicate through our work with an audience. And part of this mission is to investigate and transform the built environment on our end. And we're trying to do it also by introducing or implementing computational design, so technologies that we have available on hand, new methods of make, and also the introduction of sustainable systems and sustainable materials, which is really important, again, at this time. But I also believe that if you want to design the future, you need to sometimes look back into the past, learn from the past, understand it, think about precedents, pick up best practices while literally challenging the status quo. And in my case, before I went to the Bartlett, I had received a diploma in architecture at the Peter Behrens School of Architecture in Düsseldorf. And if you're familiar with Peter Behrens, he was kind of early leading voice of modernism. You know, Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier all used to work in his practice. So you can imagine that at the school that I was at back in the day, the ghosts of modernism were very much everywhere and around us. And I was really interested to challenge that as a paradigm and challenge the status quo. So you see here a lesser quote by Mies van der Rohe, which says, "I do not oppose form, but only form as a goal." And as much as I agree with this position, I was also noticing a certain monotony with its implication on the production of architecture. So a lot of things just looked very similar, very, the same, in my opinion, and I was just interested to kind of look for other kind of novelties. Then I was actually, through the work of Zaha Hadid, there was a book that Aaron Batsky wrote about her. That's the first time I was introduced to Russian suprematism, the movement that started in the early 20th century by the likes of like Naum Gabo, Elit Sitsky, Kazimir Malevich. And you see here the black square on white grounds, painted in 1915, where the subject of the painting is reduced to its bare minimum and represented only through its geometry and form. And of course, Malevich continued with further studies introducing other primitive shapes, such as rectangles, crosses, circles, etc. And also color, while playing with the notion of dimension and the effect of depth by layering the components within the white background, which he considered an infinite space. So this process of abstraction is what I thought might be quite interesting to also apply to my form studies that I wanted to pursue, where any notion of size, scale, function, materiality, color, program, site, context, and other parameters were considered void and non-existing, and just focus on the form itself. So I started to draw subjects which rejected primitive geometry shapes, which are still associated with the polemic of modernist principles, but rather created non-Euclidean geometries or kind of very amorph shapes, which featured slight similarities as seen in this taxonomy. So similar to the suprematist movement, I started to draw and arrange the subjects to each other, with the idea that its organization principle would always create a certain ambiguity and newness. And I'm showing here these images from Adrian Mayer's book, The First Fossil Hunters, where in ancient days, the way we assembled form can lead to different unexpected outcomes, which can create new narrative and new histories. So you can imagine when people found large bones of mammoths in the ground, not knowing that mammoths existed anymore, and they start to reassemble them, you get giants. Another ambition of the study was also to combine existing shapes with fictional shapes, similar to this experimental design of the Campo Marzio by Piranesi, where existing buildings are mixed up with made-up buildings, creating a new indexing and figure ground assemblage. So some of these buildings are actually real, some of them were totally made up by Piranesi. So I created many of these drawings with that kind of idea in mind over a period of time, which are called the White Series, really with the ambition to study form itself and its relationship to each other. It's pretty much an extensive library and collection of forms that have been generated through this process and are situated, again, in this kind of abstract environment. And some of these drawings over the years have been exhibited and published and really became an outlet for me to study form without the pressure really of thinking about function, materiality, or any kind of performance. So I'm just clicking here through some of these images, and there are actually many, many more. So I'm just showing a couple here, and some of them also quite larger in scale. But again, being a reminder of Mises' position that form is not the goal, the end goal. It's also my ambition to bring these form studies to life and use them as part of my design process, or at least trying to use them as part of my design process. But in order to do that, I realized that these forms need to be able to transform and adapt to given requirements and parameters, again, such as scale, structure, context, or program, to name a few. And as a reference here, I'm showing a diagram by Zachary Tate Porter that he produced in one of my seminars. I was teaching at Georgia Tech in the US, where he's actually analyzing the work of John Haydock. And one of his projects, the security project on the left, shows the capability to literally transform in different kind of configurations. The top one is the Villa Savoy. Then you have a military tank. If you're familiar with Haydock's work, that was quite important to him. Again, Haydock's own wall house, Haydock's house of the painter, Haydock's house of the musician, and at the end also a Trojan horse. So it's important for me to also be able to transform these forms and shapes. The process was to extract some of these forms from those drawings, charge them with performance requirements, like structure or size and scale or program, and then ultimately transform them into a design, and ideally both would form a coexistence or have a hybrid nature similar to this project by Kulani, who just recently passed away. The project called The Frog, where literally the driver merges with the motorbike. So the first project I want to show, and I'm going to show about 10, 13-ish projects, depending how much time we have, is called Public Figure. It's a bench. So I was asked to design a bench for Art Basel in Miami Beach. This was my first commission in 2011, and it was for an event, and the client asked for some sort of social arrangement that many people can participate in this kind of situation. And we took some of the forms that we looked at, and we started to kind of morph them, transform them, because a bench has to obviously offer seating, it has to be structural, it has to function. What we also try to do is think about how we can rethink what a bench does. If you think about kind of typical benches in a park, they're all very linear. You sit on it, you look in one direction, there might be a great view, but you don't really participate with the person next to you. And here the idea was to really think about that paradigm by creating, instead of a linear version, a looped version. So you kind of forced to actually look at each other, potentially start a conversation or have some informal talk. And basically through that, start to engage in some sort of social activity. The other thing is also the materiality. We had done a lot of kind of complex forms at Future Systems, used things like fiberglass and other materials to kind of cast shapes. But in this case, we wanted to use, because of the budget, something more simple. So we actually used high-density polyethylene, which is basically recycled plastic. You find that in your kind of kitchen garbage bags, for instance. So we cut, literally like shapes out of 4x8 sheets and start to assemble them in this kind of linear fashion. What you don't see really is the network that goes into this. All the pieces are parallel, but there's like hundreds of kind of like smaller pieces that are connecting each of them individually and on a network basis. Another project is Subdivision. This was a project in Eugene, Oregon. And I've collaborated for a couple of years with the very many on a few projects. There was about 7 projects we did together. I think 6 of them we won as a competition. And then we separated and kind of separated also the projects. So this is one of them, and this was interesting because at that time I was teaching at Georgia Tech. And if you're familiar with kind of, surface subdivision and how to kind of think about rationalizing surfaces, you probably get to know Greg Turk. Greg Turk is a professor at Georgia Tech who kind of came up with the initial algorithms about 20 years ago to kind of subdivide surfaces and kind of re-topologize surfaces, find the closest neighbor and these things. So we were kind of, quite happy to be in touch with him and also work on this project. So this is situated within an existing building that just got recently renovated. It's a math department. And the idea was to place something in this atrium. So you can see here the contrast between the existing structure and what we proposed. The concern was that the ceiling couldn't hold a lot of weight. So we had to propose something that's very lightweight, still something that's large enough to fill the atrium physically and visually. And the client wanted something that you can see from every angle walking up the stair. So what you see here is a sculpture that's about 14 feet high, about 12 feet wide, 5 feet wide. Do you guys do centimeters here or meters? Yeah, okay. Well, it's pretty big. What's important to say though is that we could only hang 100 kilos from the ceiling. And this sculpture is about 50 kilos. Simply because we use lightweight aluminum material, which we kind of connected together. You see here a lot of the kind of apertures that we introduced to kind of cut material and weight out. And basically the curvature of these pieces are important as well because they are, they're the kind of structural system. The more curvature, the more structural the pieces. A couple of images, just how we produced this. Again, we subdivided the surfaces with our algorithms and then started to kind of roll the pieces manually by hand. See, also those holes that we have are kind of a guide that show us in what direction we need to roll them. You see here a very basic sheet metal roller. So every piece we had the exact geometry determined, so we can change roller angles based on that and create that curvature. And then combine these into chunks and then ultimately put it into the space and connect it and assemble it in there. So what's interesting is because the algorithm that we used was quite interesting to the math professors. And what's interesting is their first year students, when they enter the school, they actually charge to calculate this structure and kind of come up with the algorithm on their own. So this is not just a device that you can enjoy as some sort of like a visual piece, but you can also start to engage with it in this kind of academic level as well. From this project, we had a chance to develop another piece in Atlanta, a bit bigger scale. It's almost like 2 or 3 times bigger in size, simply because the atrium that we had the chance to put this in was much larger. This was just a 3-story atrium. And the piece is made, again, out of very thin aluminum. This time we tried to use even thinner aluminum. It's also funny, if you think about a Coke bottle, it's very lightweight. So that's how I usually explain it to anyone. And funny enough, the Coca-Cola headquarters is right next door to this project. And the idea really was to create something that you can visualize and see from every angle. So the idea that this is a 3-dimensional piece was quite important. And again, you have kind of features that think about how they intersect, how they kind of, how the volumes somehow like start to merge and so on. Because this is a public space, we also need to make sure that this is all safe and sound and secure. So we actually had our engineers do a couple of tests. So we put these balloons in the space before we installed it. We then start to run the smoke simulator, which basically sucks smoke out of the atrium in case of fire. So we just wanted to make sure that this whole piece doesn't get kind of lifted up in the air in that kind of situation if there's a alarm. So you see here some of the kind of tools we're using, very low-tech balloons, and then high-tech kind of devices that would measure if this would work or not. And ultimately it worked, so we were able to install this. It's hanging from just a couple of cables, also for seismic reasons. But again, this piece is very large, but it's only like about 120 kilos, which is slightly more than me, I think, in terms of weights. And that was quite important for us. And I want to give you a bit of an idea how large it is in scale. Here you see it when you walk by. And from different kind of angles and views. But this is a scale comparison. There's David and a couple of other people putting it together, so you see how large this is. It's almost like a building scale, really, if you think about it. Again, material is aluminum, and it's actually pre-painted, so you get this effect of the kind of interior that's black and the exterior that's white. And there's a few kind of golden elements in there, simply because Georgia Tech's colors are gold, so they wanted that feature in there as well. But it's a piece that's now installed permanently over there, and it's something that you see on your daily commute to your classrooms. Another piece in that kind of series of volume studies is in Denver, again within an academic building. This time we had the chance to do it in a new facility that was facing a very prominent boulevard called Spear Boulevard. And the school was interested in a piece that is very visible, so it basically starts to communicate to an audience on the exterior. So there's buses that drive by, and cars, and people on their bicycles, and pedestrians. There's also a lot of kind of buildings on the other side. So this is very much a kind of extension of the school, a message to the community that's outside the school to understand what happens inside the building. So this is a piece that is partly suspended from the ceiling and partly attached to the wall. So we had to think about a totally different kind of structural system because you have different kind of components having to take on different features. Again, the notion of lightweight was quite important, but also at the same time, we wanted to make sure that people can actually engage with the piece when walking down the stairs, when driving by, and in different environments. So the notion that this thing is very dimensional, again, was quite important for us. So here you see basically that you can engage with it visually from different levels. Again, this is a piece that's not necessarily functional like a bench, so it doesn't have that kind of performance. But we use this piece to learn a lot in terms of how we can create geometry, how we can actually think about the structural system that's part of it, and how we can then take some of those ideas and apply them later to other projects that maybe require them. So for me, it's very much like a concept car that goes to a show, an automobile show that gets shown, and then you basically take the best pieces and the best practices and maybe apply it to other projects along the way. Sometimes these things are quite difficult to hang because there's an existing structure, so you have to be quite, you have to find a lot of solutions how to solve it. We had a fantastic engineer that worked on this project, Laus AD in New York, because again, this is a very lightweight piece, and we had to do a lot of FEA testing on this, but ultimately we're able to hang it so it would not rotate in certain rotations that we weren't interested in. Again, just a couple of images to show you what it takes to build something like this. You need a lot of space to put all your pieces out. The scaffolding sometimes is more difficult to design than the piece itself because you have to lower it, change it, and so on. So just a few images here of the construction of the piece, and then just a couple of final images of it itself. You see it again, the colors are very similar to the Georgia Tech colors, but again, they had also a very similar color scheme for their school. Final project for this kind of like volumetric series, it's called Emergent. This one is even bigger in size and scale. So you see here the idea that things have the chance to grow over time, simply because people trust us more and they say, well, can you do something bigger with bigger budgets and so on. Doesn't mean it's easier, but the pieces get bigger. So this is a piece in Salt Lake City in Utah. Again, it's partly attached to the wall, and then it's actually hanging from the ceiling. This time we had the chance to do it all in white. I was actually thinking to do everything in black, but nobody really accepted that as an idea. but hopefully in the future I have the chance to do it. But some of the pieces at least are monochrome, but I'll show some color a bit later as well. This piece is interesting because you enter this room which is dedicated as a gallery to that school, so that's where students exhibit their work. At the same time, it's an engineering school, so really they want to kind of highlight that kind of topic. And there's also a little bit of aerospace engineering happening, so I really wanted something that has this dynamic kind of notion, something that reads as it belongs into the future, and something that inspires students, particularly when they come to the school and want to apply or want to kind of enroll. So a piece that engages, not just students on campus, but also potential students that come to campus with their parents. But you see a little bit here the scale and size of this thing. It's also sometimes difficult to photograph because of the angle of the room and these things, but yeah, this is on the top floor looking into that space. And I think, because I talked about the drawings in the beginning, this is probably a good example how we're able to translate some of these complex shapes and forms into a three-dimensional form, again, based on those initial studies, and how we can actually bring them to life by introducing structure, material, and other performance aspects. Again, with the idea that, you can charge shapes and form from the initial kind of state and bring them to this kind of state that happens in this built environment. So moving on from these more volumetric studies to something more functional. This is called Phantom. This is a pavilion we were asked to design in Denver, Colorado, inside a park. There's this kind of island that was built inside the park. In the back is this large residential area, and towards the front you see Denver and mountains in the background. So the client wanted something a place where you can go and kind of sit down and kind of informally enjoy the view. They also wanted us to frame the views of the mountains. There's three particular mountain areas. So we came up with this idea of a pavilion that basically reflects a little bit the kind of the geometries of the landscape. This is actually one of my favorite images because of the shadow that it produces at the bottom there. What's also interesting is that we look back into kind of history. If you think about the most kind of structural system, it's really an arc. So you see here a series of arcs that are interconnected to form these kind of three dome shapes. So it's not a geometry that is necessarily fundamentally new, but maybe what's new is the kind of, or the innovative part is the way we build it. We worked with AKT, which is a London-based engineering firm, which hopefully most of you are familiar, on the structure. This is a shell structure. It's actually cross-laminated, so you have an interior shell that goes in one direction and an exterior shell that goes in a different direction. And through this kind of cross-lamination and the connection between those, it becomes structural, which means that we can make it very light material, which obviously is economically more feasible. But also through these kind of two different layers, we're also able to introduce much more effect through kind of introduction of color, for instance, or also some of the kind of cuts that we have in the facade, because obviously we wanted to bring light in to illuminate the interior of the space. At the same time, also we wanted to get this kind of pattern in addition, which is quite interesting as a shadow play. And this is a couple of the interior views of the project. The space has a bit of a kind of cathedral-like feeling when you're in there. It's very kind of peaceful when you sit there. But again, I think you can see here in some of these images the idea that you can frame some of the views of the landscape, which again, framing views is a modernist principle that you can go back to. But yeah, so here just a couple of images. The one on the right is really how you put this together. It's a large puzzle, so you have to really think about this as an IKEA kind of construction set with a very thick booklets. Piece X goes next to piece Y and so on. And it's made of basically hundreds and hundreds of pieces. Each of them have custom shape, have their own number. and their own codes, and that way they can also be positioned exactly where we need them to go. So just some of the details of this piece as well. When we first installed this, again, this is in Colorado, this is quite, I mean, it snows a lot. So obviously we had to also consider that as a factor when we did the calculations for the structure itself. But the first set of pictures we received were basic pictures in the snow, which was quite interesting because it started to blend with the initial colors palette we had, which are these shades of blues and then black and then white. And then sometimes you got these interesting kind of features and effects when the snow would settle on there as well. And this is actually, the entire park is a basin, so when it rains a lot or when the snow melts, the water level rises up and this becomes more like an island or a peninsula that you can go into. So a couple of other projects that are, again, in a different realm, which I call the Pixel Play series. So we had the chance to, again, engage with introducing a few projects on an architectural scale. So these are projects that kind of attach to buildings. They either occupy corners or occupy the parapets. Sometimes they're like almost like wayfinding devices, or they're like signals. This is a project in Durango, which is again in Colorado. It's at Fort Lewis College, and the building you see here is a concert hall. And the idea was to kind of create a signifier for the school. So again, when students would arrive, or potential students, they would see this piece, and it would create some sort of interest and kind of artistic presence. So we had the chance to repopulate this whole thing, and basically the idea was also to kind of try to get away from the monotony of those kind of block buildings that are on campus and create a bit more of a playful, colorful addition. I was actually quite interested to get rid of the corner, the sharp corner, and introduce a kind of alternative corner, which are these kind of pixelated features, which kind of soften the corner and basically eradicate it from its original kind of geometry along the way. Again, each piece has a different size, dimension, that was quite important for us as well. And what's nice is also that when the daylight changes, it changes its perception, so you will have different effects if you either walk around it, or when the sun changes, or the shadows changes, or there's a cloud that suddenly occurs. You get these totally different ways of looking at the building and understanding the piece. Sometimes it gets inverted, so you feel like it's this kind of op art illusional play, which we didn't really anticipate when we designed it, but it kind of created these effects that were quite interesting. Again, just a couple of images, what it takes to build these. There's about 500, I think, different pieces in there. Each have to be cut, milled, folded, welded, painted, cleaned, packaged, transported, and then ultimately installed. We had this amazing kind of video where we have two different lifts going up and down the facade, and then people attaching it to the wall. So it's always like they were surfing along the facade, and then slowly this thing was kind of pixelating and growing in front of your eyes. And just a few images. Again, Durango, if you've never been, you should maybe do a trip out there. It's a fantastic landscape, very picturesque. So we also were able to kind of get some interesting shots of that. Another project is called Bloom. This is, again, in Colorado, happens to be a lot of my projects there. And we had the chance to actually, again, occupy a corner. This is a building that's right across the street from Liebeskind's Design Museum. It's within the art district. So the architect who designed the building, this is a residential building, wanted something a bit more colorful than what you see in the background. So it's like gray on blues and on blacks and grays. So we wanted something that has this kind of vivid effect. So we were able to introduce these very different colors. There's actually two pieces, each on a different corner. And again, the idea was to introduce these pixels that are either growing out of the wall or are flush with the wall. In this case, flush because there's potentially another building coming next door. So we didn't have the chance to extrude these pixels too much. But again, the notion here that you can use form to kind of generate a geometry, but also you can introduce color. And through the introduction of color, you can also start to rethink the form, because the color actually like changes how the form appears. Was quite interesting. In this case, we use maybe about 5-6 different colors, but through the reflection and the tint of the color, you actually have much more color spectrum along the way. So if you go in there with your pipette in Photoshop, you'll probably find more like 20-30 colors, simply because of the way they are oriented to each other and they reflect on each other. And which again, it's not something you can simulate in your computer, but it's just something once you build it, it's this additional kind of effect that you weren't aware of. Again, idea of scale, these things are pretty large. It takes a good crew to put them together, so we're very fortunate to work with very good partners along the way. A couple of more of these. So you go from the exterior to an interior position. This is in Cedar Rapids in Iowa. There was a massive kind of indoor arena where they wanted us to do a piece within the atrium. So it's really just a decorative piece, but what it does now, it starts to kind of point towards those windows, which is where the tickets are sold. So it's more like a wayfinding or signifying device. So it goes away from just being some sort of visual device to something that has much more in terms of its function. Again, we used a series of colors that basically then, when you start looking at them closer, start to reflect on each other and create a bit of a kind of environment, which for me also has a bit of labyrinthic effect or this kind of distorted effect. And again, depending on where you are, you see these in different angles and shapes as well. There's something also about the graphic reading of this as well. Again, these are three-dimensional pieces, but sometimes they appear like they're two-dimensional pieces. Funny enough, when I applied to a project just recently, I sent some of these images as a portfolio, and I was disqualified because they said it's a rendering, and they would only accept build work. So I guess it's a compliment that some of your projects now actually are mimicking renderings or vice versa. Again, just an idea of size and scale. Again, this was quite interesting because you're able to kind of pixel by pixel see this thing grow and come to life along the way. And then just a recent project I installed in Baltimore at the University of Maryland. This is actually one of the biggest ones. These are 3 large canvases that are inside a small atrium. And this one, we had the idea to really connect them as one piece. It's more like a triptych reading. So you have these 3 kind of panels that somewhat are kind of talking to each other. So you see these kind of 3 structures. They're all variations of each other. So we use the same algorithm to kind of configure them and reorient them. And then just a couple of images that we just received a few days ago of that piece with people just sitting there smiling and so on. But again, here I think the research was to go a bit further to also introduce these kind of stripes that we haven't worked with before. So actually the pixel now gets animated, where before the pixel was static. So now we're also introducing this kind of time-based matter to it as well, which is something, again, that, I think if you do a couple of projects, you have the chance to really push them further and further along the way and introduce new kind of techniques and visuals as well. And what I like to do sometimes is also just take these into my software and just start playing with colors. I feel like this is cool because you can basically start testing it in real time. And maybe another project, if we have the chance to do it, could have these kind of colors as an option as well. And then a new project we just installed, or it's actually still in installation process, is in Boston. This is called the living room. You see here a rendering of it, but that's the Boston skyline, downtown skyline. We wanted to make a piece that you can occupy and you can kind of participate. So these are 5 structures that are sitting on a pivot. There's a frame cut out, and they have different sizes and scales. And they basically are orientated in a circle, and you can occupy them, you can rotate them, so you can really participate and kind of start to communicate in that regard. Here just a couple of the pictures in process. You see here the plan on the left where you see the different kind of orientation. And for me it was important to kind of have this, the notion of play, where you can come in and really think about how you want to occupy them, how you want to kind of engage with them, and how you orientate them. This is just before it got painted. This is in the paint booth. They didn't really know how to paint it, so they actually had to build a paint booth around them to actually pull it off. Then we put them on a truck once they were painted, and they're painted white on one side and color on the other side. And this is just a couple of pictures recently when we start installing them. Again, it's still under construction, but hopefully it will open in a couple of weeks. And again, you see the background on the right, you see the background of the city, and on those pieces that, hopefully we have some people engaging with them in the near future. Another project is called Drift. This is a bridge that we're currently building in Texas, out of all places. So we were asked to do a pedestrian bridge over a creek that gets flooded sometimes, but it's a very long creek. It's about 2 miles, and there's just no way to cross it for a long time. So they asked us to introduce a bridge there. So we proposed a bridge that, again, rethinks what a bridge does. In this case, we wanted to not just connect someone from A to B, but we also wanted someone to kind of stop at the bridge and sit down and maybe have a conversation, maybe just enjoy the landscape. But again, we want to kind of combine different functions and types with this project. We also wanted to use a material we haven't really used in the past. We've used a lot of aluminum and plastic and these things. In this case, we want to use timber simply because it has this amazing effect, and we sourced a very nice timber called Spanish cedar. It has this amazing effect of weathering and then turning into this very gray kind of color. So this is right now under construction. We're building this in Indianapolis, in a shop there. So these are the 2 beams that we already put together. The beams will get a skeleton of ribs, and these ribs will then be clad with the Spanish cedar. This is just a mock-up, but you can see here these are built-in stripes. The stripes start changing in shape and size. Again, this is all computationally designed. But you see here on the left an image of how we're milling these things. So they're actually not just flat stripes, but they actually have curvature to them. And I actually engineered so they really fit together well. This is also something where we had to really think about the penalization of the stripes a lot because of the curvature that we introduced. But I think after the second mock-up, we managed to kind of get a good grip of it. So now it's happening. So these are just a couple images where you can see the bridge kind of, following up, opportunities to sit on either sides, and then, kind of sit there, rest there, and so on. Again, this is almost like, if you think of the bridge, it's almost like an MRI scan of a brain or of the body. Every kind of section is different, which means that you have the ability to transform this bridge from one side to the other. It's about 60 feet or 62 feet long, and we designed this bridge with the idea in mind that we need to bring it from Indianapolis to Fort Worth, Texas, which is about a 2-day drive. And the idea is to really just put it on a truck and drive it over. So we actually had to check the dimension of the truck. This is an oversized load truck. So we had to check the dimension of the truck. We had to check the height. We have to check the weight. We had to get a contractor that was able to actually crane it from the truck into position, because we didn't want to build a scaffolding, would have killed our budgets. So we had to really put all these constraints into designing this bridge. So there's not just the idea of the material, the timber, the idea of the kind of how to participate with the bridge, how does it structurally work, but also these kind of other requirements. How do you actually make it happen to bring it from A to B and to install it at the end? And then also, how do you maintain it? There's a chance that you can take each piece out and then replace it in case there's something wrong with the piece or there's some damage to it, and so on. I think this is actually the last project I want to show, Cloudscape. Cloudscape was a project we were asked to do at the Fort Lauderdale Airport in Florida. They had this amazing large mezzanine space and asked us to design an interactive area, in other words, a playground. And you can imagine, if you're waiting for a flight, or if your flight is delayed, or if you, just arrived or something. Sometimes there's no way in airports to kind of just go somewhere and kind of relax and just, charge your batteries or something. Especially if you travel with children, it's a bit difficult. I have the same experience now with my daughter. So we wanted to create a space that offers a multiplicity of kind of options for participants to engage with. So we created these kind of 5 different structures within this blue environment. The floor is actually pour-in-place rubber, so it's recycled rubber. And we had to do it because ultimately it's signed off as a playground structure. If it's a playground structure, you have to get a commissioner on board who actually has to check all the details. So there's nothing sharp, there's nothing edgy. There's a whole catalog of kind of requirements you have to fulfill if you do playgrounds, including the fall height, depending how high you can fall from the structure. And the fall height determines the thickness of the rubber and the thickness of the floor. So there's all these principles that we had to build into this, in terms of engineering, in terms of material, and so on. But what was interesting for us is how do you actually engage with it? How do you participate with it? Again, looking back into the past, if you're familiar with some of Werner Panton's work, they were able to create these environments that you can really immerse yourself in. So this was, in a way, something we wanted to do as well, where you kind of go into these pieces and really have your own kind of environment. And if you kind of look through them as a kind of sectional view, you get this kind of very kind of interesting kind of correlations and kind of different kind of cuts and spaces within it. And these are just our pictures we got from our photographer. But sometimes, I managed to go on Instagram and see kind of like a hashtag of that space, and it's quite interesting how people do yoga in there, or how kids really climb onto the pieces and start kind of removing the ceiling elements. So everybody has a different way of engaging with the space, which is interesting to us because, we basically are able to create a matrix, and then within that matrix, everyone has a chance to kind of communicate and navigate on their own. But again, just an idea how these things are built, because they're these white monolithic structures, again, with almost zero detail because of these requirements for playgrounds certifications. But this is something that it took us really a long time to build. It's built like a massive puzzle. We also had to keep in mind that we are an airport. Airport has very strong fire ratings. So we couldn't use any kind of material. We had to use material that actually is fire rated Class A, which means that it's very difficult to source. There's a type of MDF called meadite, which looks pretty much like MDF, but it's just fire rated A, that we managed to get. It comes in sheets. We then started to cut these kind of puzzle pieces and started to assemble one after the other. I think the CNC machine was running for like 3 months straight, so it was really like a long process. And once it was all kind of assembled and put together, they were painted and then ultimately shipped in these kind of like smaller chunks, because again, access to that airport was a bit complex because there was just one door we could go through. And that door wasn't very wide, so we had to keep that in mind when we were building the pieces along the way. And again, because it's an airport, there's certain security measures you have to go through as well, which is very difficult. So if you want to build something at an airport, it's very tough. It's not an easy thing to do. But again, these are the structures we managed to put into place. Again, I'm really happy how it turned out, because it goes back to these initial sketches that are presented, where you're able to really think about form kind of in an abstract way. And then once you have the chance to introduce parameters like structure, material, size, scale, you're able to kind of transform these shapes and forms. and ultimately are able to maybe create an environment where, you know, kids like this young boy can kind of participate and engage, and then ultimately rest and read a book. So this concludes the talk. In remembrance of Jan Kaplitzky, who passed away a couple years ago, he used to conclude his talks by saying, I kiss you goodnight. All right, thank you.
So thanks a lot, Volkan, for this fascinating immersion into your universe, understanding the motives behind the work, but also the outcomes and how, let's say, an audience can be engaged by your beautiful installations. I would like to mention that there are drinks upstairs, but first we'll take some questions if there are any in the audience.
Thanks very much for the lecture, Volkan. It was very inspiring, and I think very timely so. I think that I'll try to articulate a question out of a comment. Hopefully I get to the end of it with a question. But what is really inspiring is the relation between simplicity and complexity on the work, it seems, no? That out of a thesis of engaging with form, no? You develop extremely complex forms, find a way to fabricate relating to a context, and there is also a belief that the photographic archiving, is also part of discovering new elements of the work. So what is very inspiring for me was the idea that the work does not rely on the complexity of argumentation necessarily outside the form, no, but I think that the idea that the relation to designing, engaging with the site, engaging with the post-occupation of that object through effects, the phenomenology of the space, how people inhabit the light. So I wanted to ask you a few of the, perhaps in a hindsight of normally what education tends to be a bit more related to creating extremely complex arguments to then output something that is perhaps less exuberant. No? So I wanted to ask you, what are some of the problematics that you encounter on working with that process, no? That you think that can communicate so clear first for you, but also for the clients?
I mean, if I understand your question correctly, I don't know if I did, but I mean, I can say that the faster you go to trying to build something, the better, at least in my experience. I've been working on a kind of conceptual level for many years, you know, in certain practices. These things were always on a paper stage. So in that regard, they were conceptual. They were, you know, like maybe just before you can maybe get it built or to a build level. But I have to say, once you engage with building, you have the chance to build. It's much more interesting than to create arguments and concepts. In this case, you know, I had the chance to build quite a few projects, and you learn along the way, and you have to really deal with other issues along the way, with kind of real life problems. When in kind of academic discourse, you can get away with making arguments in other directions. So I don't know if I don't know if that answers your question, but it's very exciting to design and get it built. For me, that's more exciting than to design and just put it on a piece of paper and put it into an archive.
You kind of described your work in a taxonomical way, in the sense that there was the volumetric stuff before, and then the pixels, and then the last project. And at one point you were also describing that with the pixels, every other iteration was getting better and bigger, and it was like a discourse on its own. But thinking of you as the creator of the heterogeneity, I wonder if you ever think of hybridizing, or if that's ever an opportunity to convince a client with the notion of a hybridization of two different discourses, rather than saying, I'm going to do a better version of the previous one. If at its simplest form, I didn't want to overcome.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, because you know, once you submit your construction sets, or once things actually are going to happen, it's almost like too late to make decisions and change it. And sometimes you have to, like for instance, the pavilion was designed 5 years ago, right? And it just got built so 2 years ago. So it's like there was a 3-year period where the design was ready, the drawings were ready. It's just the site wasn't ready. So it was sitting there for 3 years. It was approved. It was, you know, it went through engineering. So all the soft costs were spent. And you know, 3 years later, I'm looking at the design. I'm like, I would change a lot right now on that design. You know, it's just I couldn't do it. But for instance, on that design, I would have loved to, for instance, think about the exterior of that pavilion to have more texture. Right now, it's just a series of colors that are populating it. But it would have much more interesting to have some of these pixels maybe get extruded and create a much more kind of interesting silhouette. So those are things that constantly happen. And even at this piece now in Boston, there's a couple of other versions that are designed, that are building up on that piece, simply because we learned a few things through the first one, certain dimensions, sizes, and so on. So yeah, they definitely like build upon each other. So you have the best practice that you continue. And at some points, you're also able to merge some of these paths as well. And that's where, you know, it becomes either quite interesting, but sometimes it might also become a Frankenstein kind of design. I'm not sure, you know, it depends a bit.
Hi, it's very inspiring. But also at the same time, if I understand correctly, the design methodology is like to derive the design from the passion about the form. And my question would be, if you're designing a building scale, like you're designing a school or something that's in a much larger scale than more like, you know, installation, would you still use the form approach as the design methodology? Because these forms, as I perceive, are very, very complex, very fascinating. But I wonder, once it's been translating into a building scale, would there has to be some sort of like simplification, or is there going to be a difference in terms of like still starting from form, but seeing it from a more different, like I would say like a filter, almost like when you're seeing? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And maybe as Theo mentioned, you know, I had the chance to work in a couple of practices before. I had the chance to open my own practice, like Future Systems, even Foster & Partners, Asymptote Architecture. Those practices are very similar in terms of their aesthetic or their kind of interest. And they've been designing buildings and building buildings. So you can definitely start with the kind of premise of the form as an interest. But you always need to charge it with something, right? So either with technology or structure or program. So it can never stand by itself. It needs to have this kind of other parameters. But you can also start, and many people do it just with program first, right? So you can have that as an initiator, and then maybe bring other aspects in later. You can start with circulation first. It's just in my case, that's the way I looked at the diagram and how I wanted to kind of pursue it. And as long as all the pieces are on the table, it's fine. So it doesn't matter which one you pick up first. You can make that decision, but ultimately all of them have to be somewhat embedded in the design, I think.
Thank you.
Hi, Volkan. Thank you for the very enjoyable lecture. I have a question. There's two very striking things that come across about your work. The first is form and its transformation, and you spoke at some length about that. But the second is color and this ability, uncanny ability you have to use color to create a kind of graphic space. And you spoke about color, but you didn't really talk about where you draw upon your research in color, and where does that come from, and how do you bring it into the work in this with the same kind of rigor that maybe you do apply to your formal studies?
Yeah, I mean, color is a very complex topic. because everybody has an opinion about color. So sometimes when I get these commissions and I make proposals, there's a committee of up to 12, 15 people, and someone is like, well, I don't like pink, or I don't like purple, or I don't like green because the neighboring school's mascot is green or something, right? So there's sometimes these kind of ways to navigate it logistically, but the way I usually think about color is that it needs to be a contrast to its context. So if a context has a certain color palette, I'm trying to really complement it by just doing the opposite. At the same time, also, there's a gradient within the colors that complements itself. So sometimes there's shades of blue, and then maybe something that's in contrast to that. But it also goes in, by stages. Like right now, I have done, I think, 3-4 projects that are just on a kind of a pink-purple scheme. And I think I'm not going to do that for a long time now. I'm just going to probably do something else because I also got a little tired now of that. But yeah, I mean, color is difficult. But what I want to do with color is basically create some sort of signal, some sort of iconic moment where it kind of stands out. So that's usually the idea with color.
Thank you.
Hi, I wanted to ask you about assemblage. Like the first project that had like smaller pieces and require more assemblage, and what was the effect on the form, or how you think of the form of the whole because of that? And in the last one, that it also has parts in a way, but they are more like embedded and it's not so apparent. And if that, well, how do you think about this kind of relationship of the pieces and how they are assembled and the relationship with the whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think it maybe goes back to the notion of digital fabrication. It's been something that, this discipline has been doing for the last 15 years or so. You got machines like, laser cutters, CNC machines, water jets, robots, printers, and so on. And each of these technologies have their own kind of materiality or trace. Like if you think about the CNC machine, sometimes you still see the cuts of the machine on the material, on the surface. So it creates its own kind of, let's say, index, right? So those are things that you can't necessarily plan for, but they're just an after effect. Actually, for the curved projects, we tried to engage with a really good car body modeler or shaper in San Antonio, and he's like one of the masters in actually making car bodies out of single aluminum shapes. So we talked to him, we had a really good discussion. He's using these like English wheels to form and shape them. He's using kind of section cuts to get the right curvature. Very meticulous, especially if you deal with metal, like when things expand, like it's a bit more difficult than you can imagine. So we engaged with him. We did a lot of had a lot of conversations, but ultimately we couldn't do it financially. So then we had to find another way to create these shapes and forms. I would have maybe liked to use fiberglass and do some molds. That would have been also very expensive. So we had to really find an alternative. So we had to tackle the economic problems, really, and look into ways to kind of do things. But again, if I think about future system, I used to work, you're probably familiar with the media center here in London, right, which is built in a shipyard in the Netherlands, because those were, back in the day, the only people that could build that form. Because the technology that shipbuilders had was kind of similar to what Jan had in mind, building that. And architects couldn't build that, so he had to find other things. So I'm not sure if that answers your questions, but yeah, there's always let's say, an effect on something, like using different technologies that sometimes you can plan for and sometimes it creates something unexpected.
I mean, there are two things that were pretty enlightening today in today's presentation. I mean, the first one you just mentioned, the desire of not remaining on paper and rendering, and the effort of democratization through the use of simple flat sheet materials that are that anybody could actually do in the school now with the CNC we have. Whereas the previous generation of future systems were using super elaborate, super expensive say, manufacturing techniques, and through most of the time the use of transfer of technologies with, automotive industries or shipbuilding, as you mentioned. So that is one concern, like an effort of democratization and breaking into the real. And the second one is, when you mentioned Behrens previously, and that as some kind of motive that somehow shaped your entire trajectory from coming to London to all the decisions you made in choosing places to train and the current direction of your office, I felt quite compelled, and it was very resonant to me. Who was, David and I, for example, we also studied in Belgium, and that kind of the boredom and the kind of modernist paradigm and this fascination for austerity, which has now become austerity chic. It's a proper movement now. And the fascination of boredom somehow, as if that's something that should be celebrated. And so what I really appreciated in the work is that there are two clear phases in my mind. One is the parasitic one, where your installations are set within an existing building, which is as boring as it gets, like a commercial structure that you are invited to transform somehow and to fight. So the first set of installations are a bit like Trojan war machines that occupy a boring corporate atrium, and that are meant to provide what the 10,000 square meter building doesn't do for its users, right? I think there's a level of, you mentioned that the effects of the piece are a bit latent, but I think the diagrams are quite specific in the way that they try to engage the audience visually, they try to activate the body, they try to, let's say, push the users to try to find viewpoints and interesting vistas through the work. So rediscover a very banal and boring space. And there's a pursuit for pleasure somehow, a form of hedonism. The second thing is when you move into architectural pieces with the bridge and the vaults, where all the principles that you accumulate through those experiences, or the kind of design drivers or the motives behind the practice, where they become they're much more aligned and much more deliberately deployed on deliberate pieces, And I think it's really promising to see the bridge, for example, and other things to come where let's say your design sensibility doesn't have to fight anymore the existing, but is somehow autonomous and can provide can be autonomous from the kind of boredom in which we have to operate in somehow. And in that sense, I think you want a very unique voice, that basically preaches a level of optimism, playfulness, and I mean things that have become taboo in most continental schools of architecture, like as if architects are meant to order people in work. Like we always hear about labor. Like our role in life is to put people behind benches and to put them to work. And I think your work is completely opposed to that position, and yeah. Any other questions? I told you, my students are fearless.
I have a microphone. I just wanted you to comment a bit maybe on the construction process. So you mentioned a bit about like assemblies and how you tried to work with the car manufacturer, but then you had to think of an alternative because of cost. I'm just wondering if you yourself are ever, because of the scale, directly involved in the assemblage of pieces, and also if you're there when they're manufacturing it and putting it together and telling them like which piece goes with which one. So if you could just comment a bit on that process.
Yeah, so in the beginning, yes. I just need to understand it myself, to delegate maybe later. So yes, in the beginning I was also assembling myself and putting them together and, being there. But now I'm kind of detached from that process simply because the collaborators that I work with, they know how we can put these things together. And to be honest, maybe a couple of years ago, I would have just talked about the fabrication, and this would have been just a fabrication lecture. But now I'm more interested in like, what do these pieces produce once they're actually in the world? Or things like, ADA requirements, which is like Disability Act and these things, like, yeah, you can design anything, but is it actually confirmed to policy, for instance? That's much more interesting now to me than how they're put together, because we've done it so many times now that it becomes a very kind of like process that we're very familiar with, and so now there's other things that are of interest. Yeah, but I mean, it was fun to like.
So you work with the same collaborators every time, or similar
There's
ones,
two-
and they've learned through
Yeah,
the
there's
process?
2-3 different partners that we've done many projects with. One is in Colorado. We've done probably 7 projects with them. And, they know my work now very well, and, I trust them. They do fantastic work, and, it's something that takes time to build. But over time, it worked out very well. All right, let's have some drinks. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Volkan. Thank you so much.